We're going to continue our study tonight in the account of Jesus' burial, which is just a few short verses between the crucifixion and the resurrection. And our baseline for the study, since this account occurs in all four Gospels, we're going to read from Matthew 27. And to give you an overview, we're going to read Matthew 27, verses 57 through 61, noting that up to this point, we've gotten through verses 57 and 58. And so as we move forward tonight, it will be at a little bit more of an accelerated pace as we continue through the remaining three verses. I'm reading from King James, starting in Matthew 27, verse 57. When the evening was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Jesus' disciple. He went to Pilate and begged the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body to be delivered. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. And there was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary sitting over against the sepulchre. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we made it just about to the end of verse 58, and we were doing what's called the harmony of the Gospels. We're comparing the accounts from each of the Gospels. We can glean certain details from each of these, noting that they are indeed in harmony with each other. And when you truly compare the details, even though some have slightly different details, we see that they do indeed mesh, that there is not any contradictions to be found here. Which is a very important point, because some people will say, there's got to be contradicting itself, since you see some details, for example, in the Gospel of John that you don't see in Matthew, and vice versa. And when you really truly study these out, you'll find that all of those different details actually support each other. They're not in contrast. And as we ended last week, we note that Pilate commanded the body to be delivered. This is a very interesting fact. It proves the point that not only is Joseph, he was a member of the Sanhedrin, right? So he had influence. And before commanding the body to be delivered, we noted that Pilate first verified this with the centurion who witnessed the crucifixion. And that the centurion had to be a credible source. These were soldiers. They were trained to know when a body on the cross was dead. In fact, if they got the details wrong and they misreported on that, there were some pretty harsh and severe consequences. If you read about the different laws that the Roman soldiers had, that they lived under, they could be flogged, they could be beaten, they could be killed. There were a number of different punishments. They also had rewards for doing good things, but the punishments were severe enough that they would rather die in battle than run from the battlefield, because the consequences would be worse than the death they would suffer on the field. So the centurion was a very credible source. And we see here that Pilate commanded the body. This speaks to the disposition of Pilate himself. And you can read about that account in Matthew 27 a little bit earlier in the chapter. You can go back to verse 24. And you can read there that when Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult or maybe a riot, some versions might have, was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. At that point, Pilate was just looking after himself, was he not? He was the governor, and if he was to have a tumult or a riot on his hands, his own governorship could be at stake. So he was really just saving himself in that circumstance. But if you read that whole account, you can even see that his wife had a dream about Jesus earlier and warned Pilate about this. She said, have nothing to do with this man. But Pilate didn't see any wrong per se in Jesus. In fact, he offered Barabbas up first. He offered Barabbas to them twice. And they said, no, we want Jesus. So Pilate did not have a disposition necessarily against Jesus. to start with. And the body could not have been turned over without his consent. Either way, Pilate consented. The exact reason may be unknown, but with the context we know that he wasn't necessarily set against Jesus as the Jews were. The taking of the body. Joseph took the body in verse 59 there, and when Joseph had taken the body, that would have been hard to do as one person. And though it's not stated here, we don't know for certain who exactly helped. We do know Joseph was rich. He may have had servants. And even if he had done it alone, it would have been quite a chore. But we do know that Joseph did take the body. He was responsible for taking it. And as we move forward, we can take a look at the Gospel of John for a moment. We'll see in John chapter 19, verse 39, that there's another individual spoken of. His name, Nicodemus. The Nicodemus, and I quote, which at first came to Jesus by night. Where do we know Nicodemus from? We've heard that name before. John chapter 3. Yes, Jill. John chapter 3, verse 2. In fact, if you read the account from verses 1 through 10, you can get a lot of information there about Nicodemus. Nicodemus himself was also a Pharisee. He appears in John chapter 3, verse 1. He appears again, interestingly, in chapter 7 of John, chapter 7, verse 50, and then here for the third time in John 19:39. In John 3, verse 1, it notes that he was a ruler of the Jews. Paint the picture. Not only do we have Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, an honorable member of the Sanhedrin, we've also got Nicodemus there too. So two rulers of the Jews, and they're helping each other bury Jesus. What an amazing picture of people from all walks of life that Jesus reached during his time, and how he still reaches people of all walks of life even today. You might ask yourself, well, was Nicodemus a follower of Christ? I would direct your attention to John chapter 7, verse 50, and consider the context. We know he came to Jesus by night in John chapter 3. He came with questions. We don't know if he was afraid of being seen in front of other people asking questions of Jesus, or if he just wanted to get Jesus alone because of the multitudes throughout the day. He just couldn't get Jesus alone. But he came to him by night. And in John chapter 7, verse 50, if you read that account, he actually defended Jesus. And then he brought and here we see in John chapter 19 that he brought a very large amount of myrrh and aloes. The record does not say explicitly either way if he was a follower of Christ, but just consider the context. He came and questioned Jesus in John chapter 3, and in fact, Jesus was pretty blunt with him in that discussion. And then later on in 7, he's actually defending Jesus in front of others. And now he's here helping Joseph to bury the body, bury him in a way fit for a king. This is someone who was devoted to Jesus. This was not just any person. It was not just even any follower, perhaps. If you go to some of the commentaries, they'll say different things. They'll say maybe he was a secret friend of Jesus, though maybe not a constant follower. They might suggest that he was ashamed or afraid, but he loved and believed in Jesus as he shows his respects here. It's possible here, the fact that they were both rulers of the Jews, and the amount of myrrh and aloes that he brought, Joseph and Nicodemus may have had a lot in common. And though the text does not say explicitly, we definitely see the gospel account here a very strong sense of devotion. Not anyone would come and risk themselves to bury Jesus like this. Myrrh and aloes, we see that also in John 19. This is really the only account where it speaks to Nicodemus, as in the Gospel of John here. Does anybody have an amount in your Bibles? Does it say how much that he brought?
100 pounds.
about 100 pounds. Does anybody have 75? Any versions out there with 75? And you might wonder, well, what is this, 100 versus 75? Keep in mind that 100 pounds, this, first of all, that's a lot more than what was going to fit in the linen when they wrap his body, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Mine says liters.
Yes, so what this is speaking to, a Roman libra is what it's called, is equal to 11.56 ounces. So in other words, almost 3/4 of a pound. A Roman libra is just a little bit under an English pound. So the 100, for those of you who have 100 pounds, that's the Roman libra. And those of you who have 75 pounds, I think when you actually do the math, it comes closer to 72 pounds, but that's the English poundage. So just keep that in mind. There is no contradiction there. It's just a difference in the translations, which unit they used, whether it was Roman units or English units. So the myrrh and aloe is about 75 or 100 pounds, depending on your units. These spices, if you will, were meant to prevent the odor of decomposition. And perhaps, you know, these individuals here, perhaps Nicodemus and Joseph, including the apostles as well, maybe they did not expect the resurrection. Maybe they didn't. But we do know in Psalm chapter 16, verse 10, that Jesus' flesh was prophesied to not see corruption. So his flesh would not see corruption. So myrrh, that's not a word we see very often, except maybe in the Bible. What is it? It's really a bitter gum. It's like a resin. It could also be used as a costly perfume. It was very expensive. It came from trees, primarily in Arabia and Egypt. And you would make incisions of the bark, and that sap would come out. And the best analogy that I could come to for maybe our area of the world, you might think of globs of pine sap, or maybe you've heard of spruce gum, which is the sap of a spruce tree. Myrrh is like that, as far as our equivalent of what we might see in nature. So it comes from a tree. It's a resin. And then we see aloes. We all think aloe vera, right? Sunburns. Let's get that skin taken care of after the burn. That's not what this kind of aloe is. This is actually another tree product. It comes from a tree, most likely from eastern India or China. It was also, like myrrh, very aromatic. It was a bitter wood that was used in fumigation, and it was also used in embalming the dead. So both myrrh and aloes were common when embalming, when burying people. Chips of the higher quality wood are said to be worth their weight in gold. So this is not cheap stuff. The mixture of the two, they would have been most likely pounded and mixed together to help resist the decomposition and odor that comes with death, of course. So sort of like a pulp. And it would have most likely been placed within the linen that wrapped the body. I don't know if it was pre-mixed or if they mixed it on site when Nicodemus came. It doesn't exactly say. But I can tell you Nicodemus came prepared. That's a lot. That's a lot. A lot that more than would have been buried. They would have probably had to set the rest of it aside. It is alleged that this amount, this 100 pounds, if you will, could be worth, in today's dollars, maybe $150,000 to $200,000 worth. This is expensive. And that maybe a traditional household that can afford to bury their dead, they might have up to 5 pounds in a traditional household of that day. So we're talking 20 times what a traditional household might have. So this is the ability to bury a lot of bodies. Yes, Jill?
For one of the definitions here, it's talking about it was like embalming the body.
Yes, that's another word for it, is embalming. That's what these spices were used for. In this case, this is not the same kind of embalming that you see from the Egyptians. So, for example, the Egyptians would eviscerate, take out the insides. Sometimes they'd even take out the brains. The Jewish custom, and we see here in John 19 that he was buried in accordance with the custom of the Jews. The Jews did not do that as part of their embalming process. It's most likely they would have spread it out across these linen strips that they cut. Then this would have been, and we'll talk about the linen in just a minute, and they would have wrapped the body with that, and then the rest of the excess would have been beside the body. It would have been in the tomb with him. If you go back to 2 Chronicles, just for a moment, we visited this in the very beginning of our study. 2 Chronicles 16. This is King Asa. Remember, I think he was of the lineage of David, and he died. He slept with his fathers, and in 16 verse 14 it says, "And they buried him in his own sepulchres, which he had made for himself in the city of David, and laid him in the bed which was filled with sweet odors and divers kinds of spices prepared by the apothecary's art. And they made a very great burning for him." So that sounds like there may have been some fumigation involved there as well. But note here that it was diverse spices, it was sweet odors, and he had his own tomb. You see a lot of parallels here. Joseph, actually, it was Joseph's tomb that he gave to Jesus, but it was his own. No one had ever been in it before. It was new. And we'll see that is key as well. But just know, Jesus was buried indeed as a great king, the king that he is. And that exemplifies Nicodemus' love and devotion. Let's move on to that clean linen cloth we see in verse 59. It would have been a fine and costly cloth. It would not have been just your run-of-the-mill cheap stuff. John chapter 19, verse 40 gives a little bit more insight, as these clothes were strips. By the Greek definition of those clothes, those are strips or swaths of linen. So it wasn't just a big sheet that he was wrapped all in. They were strips. They were strips and swaths. They were like medical bandages. And it demonstrates John's knowledge of the Jewish burial customs as well. And again, this is not the same as the Egyptian form of embalming. This is different. We spoke as to the manner of the Jews is to bury. That's also in John 19, verse 40. We don't know this, but I can tell you that when you look up the Jewish manner of burial, they washed the body before they were embalmed, so to speak. You can reference that in Acts 9, verse 37. Now, the gospel accounts here do not explicitly state that Jesus was washed, but do note that was the custom. And so usually the body was washed before wrapping of the body. Joseph and Nicodemus did all of this together. They did this part together. And it had to be men, because another Jewish custom was that the men did this for the men, the women did this for the women. They didn't mix gender. And though we can see, and you might write this note, Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23, that there refers specifically to hanged criminals, and Jesus was hung as a criminal. It was the custom to bury hanged criminals within a day as a matter of respect. Also consider, this would have been a hot climate as well. And Josephus recorded that it is forbidden to let a corpse lie unburied. So not only do we see this in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23, that we've also got the historian Josephus attesting to this as well, and this is all part of Jewish custom. So keep in mind, when it was as the manner of the Jews is to bury, Joseph and Nicodemus followed it to a T. The Jews who got Jesus hung on the cross, they didn't care. They just wanted him dead and for the world to see. But they still followed the law. Matthew chapters 27, verse 60. And laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. Only Matthew records that the tomb was Joseph's own new tomb. What generosity that is. That had to have been expensive. Now, obviously, we know that Joseph was a wealthy man, But still, what generosity to give your own new tomb up. Luke and John, the Gospels there, verify that the tomb was one in which no one had yet laid in. This is a significant point to note, as these tombs were often made to accommodate several bodies, not just one. Oftentimes they were made to accommodate a number of bodies. And placing Jesus in a, quote, new tomb that had never been occupied would mean that Jesus was not rendered unclean. We can see, if you go back to Numbers, chapter 19, verse 16. Let's read that briefly. Numbers, chapter 19, verse 16, reads, "And whosoever toucheth one that is slain with a sword in the open fields, or a dead body, or a bone of a man, or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days." Jesus did not see any corruption. He did not touch or come even close to another dead body. This also affirms the resurrection, does it not? Because you can't say that there was anybody else in that tomb that could have risen. There's only one that could have arisen. It couldn't have been anybody else. Also, in the beginning of the study, we spoke to the prophecy in Isaiah 53, verse 9. You can write that down, Isaiah 53, verse 9. We won't read it, but it says that he would be in a grave with the wicked and with the rich. We see this two-grave concept, a grave with the wicked and with the rich. Well, how does that happen? Well, he did die with criminals. And sometimes Romans left the bodies to rot. Sometimes they buried them. We don't know what the Romans had planned. They didn't seem to care a whole lot. But we do see that the word rich could have been a prophecy of Joseph's new tomb, could it not? He died with the wicked on the cross, but yet, and then when he was buried, he was in Joseph's new tomb. Psalm 16:10, "Neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption." The prophecy here is fulfilled with Jesus in the new tomb. He was not tainted by another corpse. We see in verse 60, he hewn out in the rock. Because I have a geology background, I'm kind of interested. What was this rock? And Hubie, you were over there. Did you see any of the rocks of the area when you took your trip to Jerusalem?
Rocks like where the tomb was?
Yes.
There was a garden similar to that with the actual tomb.
Right, they would have been hewn out of the rock. And this rock was most likely a limestone. It could have been a sandstone or a dolostone, dolostone is very similar to limestone, but most likely a limestone. And most of you have heard of a limestone. And it would have been hewn right out of the solid rock there. Did you have something, Jill? Oh, okay. And in that area in Jerusalem, there are a lot of tombs in that area and the surrounding area, and that particular rock is all over the place there. There's limestone everywhere out there. This great stone, as we see in Matthew 27, verse 60, the other gospel, we see Mark 16 mentions just stone. We don't see much mention we see Luke 23:53 and the parallel in John 19. We don't see any stone mentioned in John, except we see it in 20 verse 1. We see the mention of the stone. And in Luke, we see it in the next chapter in 24 verse 2. So all four mention a stone. We see here in Matthew, it's great. It's a great stone. And in Mark 16 verse 4, it's very great. So if you compare that parallel, Mark 16:4, very great. The stone would not have been very high or tall, if you will, because we see in John chapter 20, verse 5, and Luke 24, verse 2, that Peter actually had to stoop down to look in. So the stone couldn't have been super tall. The tomb entrances typically were not large. The stones themselves are probably anywhere from 4 to 6 feet in diameter, maybe about a foot thick. And a small stone, you might see a small stone in average weight around 600 to 700 pounds. A great stone, a heavy stone, could weigh up to 2 tons. We're talking 4,000 pounds. I don't know the weight of this stone, but we know that it is a very great stone, so it had to be hefty. I'm guessing it's probably a little bit more than the 600 to 700 range. Either way, isn't that a heavy stone by itself, even the small ones? The stone would have most likely have been set into a groove. So you've got this round stone. There would have been a groove, and typically there would have been, you have the tomb entrance, and you got a little bit of an incline going out each side. Well, the tomb would have been rolled inside of a bit of a groove into the front of that entrance. And there would have been an outer wall on the other side of the stone. So you've got the tomb. You've got a tomb here, the stone rolls in front of it, and then you've got an outer wall. And that outer wall helps to hold that stone in place. Because you could imagine it'd be really hard to get one of those back up if it fell down flat. Also, if it was at a decline, it would have been very hard to roll that stone back out of place, too. Yes, Jill?
I saw a deal that was saying that how some of the tombs, too, when you're talking about Peter stooped, well, they had to stoop to go down some stairs.
Yes.
And then it opened
Yep.
up into a bigger area where the body was laying.
Yep, that would have been another likely reason for Peter stooping. There are a lot of tombs where they would have had stairs going down into the entrance. Again, the entrance itself would have not been very tall. All you're going to do is lay a body flat in there. It didn't need to be high. But yes, you're right. There most likely, in a lot of the tombs, there are steps that lead down to that tomb entrance. So you have that outer wall. You've got those steps going down through there. You get down to that groove and then into the entrance. 2 men, maybe it was Joseph and Nicodemus, 2 men often could be used to roll the stone into place. Just keep in mind, because a lot of these tombs had that incline, it could have been very difficult to roll it back out. And we know, according to the gospel account, take a look at Mark 16, verses 1 through 3, that 3 women couldn't do it. Now, how can we get this? The next question we'll address next week, and next week will probably be our last week on this study. We're going to ask the question of where this tomb was. We're going to finish out verse 60 and 61. We're going to take another look at the possibility of where he was buried. We're going to take a look at who else has been involved. We're going to take a look at the Marys here. And then we're going to conclude our study on this burial account. My time is up. Jeff has the devotional, and I think he's also got an invitation song picked out. I appreciate your attention, and if you have any questions or following this or have anything you want to discuss, feel free to hit me up afterwards, and I can do a recap next week and maybe address some of that. So thank you so much for your attention.